I knew my pen pal's handwriting better than my own, the way the letters leaned when he was tired, the way the ink pooled where he stopped to choose a word. In 2 years, I never learned his last name. He wrote through a box with no return address. And strange things happened around my letters. The $18,000 my mother's flower shop owed, paid overnight, by a family trust no one could find. The man who cornered me at closing, walked out by 2 strangers who nodded to me, not to him. If you've ever loved someone you couldn't see all the way through, you already know why I kept writing. I was the only one in the city who knew the man without the name. Everyone else knew the name without the man. I found out which one mattered the morning he walked free, when 40 engines went silent outside the gate, and the whole street knelt to him. He was holding the flower I'd mailed him 2 years ago. The kneeling came at the end. The beginning was an envelope so light I almost threw it away with the seed catalogs. It was February, the month my mother died, and the shop still smelled like her, eucalyptus and cold water and the green blood of cut stems. I was 28, wrist deep in a bucket of roses nobody had ordered, when I found the card her grief counselor had left tucked under the register. A letters program at the county library. Write to someone who has nobody, the card said. I laughed, one short, ugly laugh. I was someone who had nobody, and apparently the cure was 2 of us. I wrote the first letter at the counter after closing, the space heater ticking against my ankles. I didn't write anything brave. I wrote that the cooler hummed in B flat, that my mother used to sing under it, that $18,000 of her debt now lived in my name, and I talked to the peonies anyway because silence was worse. His reply came 9 days later. No name on the envelope, just initials. The handwriting stopped me before the words did, upright, exact, pressed deep enough to feel from the back of the page, like a man who had decided everything twice before writing it once. He didn't pity me. He asked what B-flat sounded like. He asked what peonies needed in winter. And when I asked what he was in for, he answered with a sentence I would carry for 2 years. I'm paying a debt that has my name on it. He signed it M. I sent the second letter with a sprig of sweet alyssum pressed flat between wax paper, the little white flower that grows in pavement cracks, because it seemed like something a man in a cell might want to know existed. His answer came back faster. Keep one on the counter, he wrote. I'll know the shop is still standing. I told myself it was a figure of speech. But I put the alyssum by the register, and some nights, locking up in the dark, I caught myself looking at the street like the street might be looking back. The letters became weekly, then twice weekly. I told him things I hadn't said out loud since the funeral, that I kept my mother's apron on its hook because moving it felt like a second burial, that I was more afraid of the shop surviving than failing, because surviving meant this was my life now. He told me about light. How it moved across a wall in a place he never named. How a man learns to keep time by meals and count his life in mail days. But when I asked his full name, the letter that came back skipped the question like a stone over water. When I asked which facility, the reply took 3 weeks, the only late letter in 2 years, and said simply, not yet. When I asked the program coordinator, she did something I'd never seen her do. She looked at the ceiling, then at the door, and said some matches are handled differently. His next letter arrived before I'd even told him I'd asked. Stop asking the coordinator questions, it said, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. Ask me. I'll never lie to you. I'll only ever leave things out. I should have been frightened. Mostly what I felt was seen, and if you've ever been truly alone, you know how close those 2 things live. The debt was due to break me in March. The lender operated out of a paneled office above a laundromat, the kind of place where the carpet smells like burnt coffee. I went in with a folder of payment plans. The clerk pulled the account, and his face did something complicated. Paid, he said. In full. 18,000, wired Tuesday. He turned the screen toward me like he wanted it away from himself. Paid, remitted by family trust. No name. When I asked which family, the clerk looked at me the way the coordinator had looked at the door, and told me to have a blessed day. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold and shook, not with relief. With the specific, electric anger of being handled. That night I wrote him the cruelest letter I ever sent. I didn't ask to be bought. I am not a debt you settle from a cell. Who do you think you are? His reply was 2 sentences long. Consider it interest, your letters are the only thing in this place that isn't a wall. And then, beneath it, a postscript pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. Don't thank me. Thank you would mean you owe me, and you will never owe me. Not you. I would come back to that postscript later, when I finally understood what owing a man means in his world, and what it cost him to refuse it. April taught me the difference between money and reach. The lender was paid, but the collector he'd used, a freelancer with a gold watch and a longshoreman's hands, didn't like how his cut had evaporated. He came into the shop at 10 to close, flipped the sign to closed with one finger, and explained, softly, that paperwork burns, and accounts have a way of reopening for women alone. I remember the cooler humming its stupid B-flat. I remember the scissors on the counter, 6 inches from my hand, and doing the math on them. I never touched the scissors. The bell over the door rang, and 2 men I had never seen came in like weather. No shouting. One of them said something into the collector's ear that took less than 10 seconds, whatever it was drained him from the top down. He left without so much as glancing at me. And the other man, gray coat, silver tie pin shaped like a little fairy, looked at me, only me, nodded once, and followed his friend into the dark. I locked the door and stood with my back against it, heart going like a bird in a paper bag, and understood, with total clarity, that I had just been protected by something with a structure. Not a friend. A system. Who are you? I wrote that night. No greeting. Just that. The answer came in 5 days. The kind of man whose name would cost you more than that debt did. He'd underlined nothing, dramatized nothing. 2 years, Nora. Then you can decide what to do with it. It was the first time he'd ever used my name. I read it in his handwriting and heard it in a voice I'd never heard, and that was the moment I stopped pretending this was a pen pal. If you've ever caught yourself loving someone in the exact moment you learn to fear them, then you already know the season I lived through that spring. I decided to wait for him. Worse, I told him so, on paper, in ink, in my own hand. I've done braver things since. I haven't done many. The letter that came back had been opened. You could see it if you looked, the flap re-glued a breath off center, the censor stamp sitting wrong, a stranger's thumb smudged in the margin like a bruise. And folded inside, in handwriting that was not his, cramped, hurried, leaning left, was a card. Stop writing. He is not what you think. Last warning. Everything in me went quiet and cold, the way the shop goes when the power cuts out. Because here is what I understood, standing at the counter with that card, someone else was inside our letters. Every soft thing I had mailed into the dark, my mother's apron, my fear of surviving, I will wait, existed now in a stranger's hands, and strangers who copy love letters do not do it out of curiosity. His response, when it came, was 1 line, and signed, in his own upright hand, "Whatever you receive that isn't mine, keep it. I'll want to see it." 41 days. I kept the card. I counted the days. And I didn't stop writing. Stay with me here, because this next part is the part one still don't tell right, even now. I took the bus to the prison on a Thursday in June with a paper bag of lemon muffins like an idiot, because in my head the man walking out was a person you hand a muffin to. I never got within 100 feet of the gate. The street was full. Black cars nose to tail down both curbs, 40 of them, engines off, and that was the detail my body understood before my mind did. Engines off. Nobody idles outside a prison. Waiting costs nothing only when you're certain, and every man on that street was certain. They stood beside their cars in good coats, hard-handed men arranged like a garden, planted, spaced, tended. Not one of them spoke. Somewhere a chain moved, a buzzer sounded, the small door inside the big gate opened, and the man who stepped out into the light was tall and still and wore 2 years of concrete like a tailored suit. The street knelt. Not all the way to the ground, this isn't a fairy tale, but 40 men bowed at the waist in one movement, heads down, and held it, and the sound it made was worse than sound, leather and wool and total silence, a congregation with no hymn. Beside me a woman with a visitor's badge whispered the name the way people say words they're afraid we'll hear them. Severino. I knew the name. Everyone in this city knows the name, it's in the harbor, in the courthouse, in the way certain streets get repaved fast and certain warehouses never burn. Matteo Severino, the heir who went inside and turned the family quiet for 2 years. And every strange kindness of my last 2 years stood up at once and got in line beside those cars, the trust with no name, the strangers with quiet hands, the fairy on a silver tie pin, a coordinator afraid of a ceiling. Each one alone, I had explained away. Together they had only ever spelled one word, and the word was bowing back at me from a prison gate. Then he turned his head and found me. Not searched, found, immediate, exact, a man checking the one fixed point on his map. Across 100 feet, over the bent backs of his whole kneeling world, and in the breast pocket of his coat, pressed flat behind gray wool, I saw a small white smudge that my hands knew before my heart caught up. Pavement flowers. I ran. Give me this much. I stayed long enough to see him not follow. He let me go, and the letting was louder than any engine on that street. He came to the shop 3 days later, alone, on foot, at 4 in the afternoon, no cars, no coats, no men. The bell rang like it did for anyone. He stood among my buckets in the eucalyptus cold with his hands loose at his sides, and up close he was worse, because handwriting has no voice, and his voice was low and unhurried and did not match a single nightmare I'd built. He asked for 2 dozen of whatever needed rescuing most. Like a customer. Like a man practicing being ordinary. I gave him the peonies and my anger with the stems still wet. Everything I'd told him, grief, fear, the apron, weight, mailed to a man who edited himself down to initials. He took all of it without defending a word. And when I finally ran out of voice, he set the truth on the counter between us, plain as making change. The charge was his brother's. 17 years old, set up to be caught driving what he was told was nothing, on a route he was told was safe, arranged from inside the family, to force the succession open. A war would have followed the trial, Matteo said, and wars in his world are paid in nephews and bus stops. So he took the wheel in the story, took the plea, sent the kid 2,000 miles away to a school with ivy on it, and spent 2 years in a cell doing arithmetic on paper no one thought a prisoner could keep. I told you once, he said. I was paying a debt that had my name on it. I never lied to you, Nora. I left things out. There's a difference, and I don't expect it to be enough. Through the window, across the street, a man in a gray coat took up a post by the lamppost, silver fairy glinting at his throat. Matteo followed my eyes and didn't pretend. That's Piero's corner, he said, gently. It has been for 2 years. And I thought about all those nights locking up in the dark, looking at a street that looked back. So I wrapped his peonies and overcharged him, and he paid it with something close to a smile and left his coat, folded on the bench. Because the shop is cold, he said, and you stand in it 12 hours a day. The dinner invitation arrived that same week on paper heavier than any flower ever wrapped in. Carlo Severino requests the pleasure. The uncle. The Regent, the papers called him. Piero of the lamppost walked me to the car they sent, and his face was a locked room the whole way, and that told me more than the invitation had. Carlo received me in a dining room the size of my whole shop, all dark wood and quiet staff, smelling of veal and old smoke, and he was charming the way ice is smooth. Family, he kept saying, and I sat with my hands in my lap and watched a man at the wall who never once looked away from a spot above my head, a narrow man with ink on his shirt cuff, blue-black, stamped, the exact bruised color of a censor's roller. And then Carlo, over the second course, folded his hands, smiled like a photograph of a smile, and quoted my own letter back to me. He said my mother's apron still hangs on its hook, in a voice made entirely of sympathy. He said, "Grief makes a shop so heavy, dear, doesn't it? $18,000 heavy." He said, "And now you've decided to wait for him." How devoted. Word for word. My words, my ink, my 2 a.m. heart, filed and memorized by a man passing the bread. "I want you to write one more letter," he said, still warm. "Tell my nephew prison changed him. That the man you wrote to didn't come home. He'll believe grief from you. Grief is your instrument, dear." And that narrow man by the wall finally looked at me, and Carlo said, in exactly the same pleasant voice, "Or the next man who visits your lovely shop won't stay for answers either." I didn't know yet that the quiet was where Matteo was most dangerous. That evening I learned where I was most dangerous too, because I looked at the man who had read every private word I'd ever written, and I said, "I'll think about it," and my voice didn't shake, and that was the first lie I ever told inside that family, and it bought me the night. I went to Matteo with all of it, the quote, the cuff, the threat, my one bought night, and watched 2 years of composure stop moving. Not rage. Stillness, the kind water gets before it decides. And then the man his whole world answered to offered me a door out. He said it simply, like handing me a receipt. "The debt stays paid, the protection stays whether you ever see me again, the letters come back to you tonight, and my name never stands near yours again. Say the word, Nora, and I'm a man you wrote to once." I asked him instead about the thing that had been sitting under my sternum since the gate. 2 years ago. A grief program. A random match. Random, Matteo? He could have softened it and I would never have known. He didn't. "Once," he said. "Random once. Your first letter reached me by luck, a bored volunteer, an even stack. Every letter after that, I arranged. I bought the program's silence so your envelopes would keep coming to me and no one else. It was the most selfish thing I have ever done, and I did it in a cell where your handwriting was the only thing that proved the world still had soft things in it." He looked at the counter, at the alyssum in its dish by the register, 2 years dried. "The men in my life are bowing to the wrong person," he said quietly. "I know exactly who kept me human. And I have watched her wrap flowers in the cold for 2 years without being able to warm the room. Here's what I did with the door he left open. I closed it, from the inside. You told me I'd decide what to do with your name," I said. "I'm keeping it in my mouth a while longer." And his breath went out of him, once, rough, a sound I have never heard him make since, and that small broken exhale undid me more than the motorcade. More than the kneeling street. You can bow 100 men at a gate. You cannot fake that sound. The council met 11 days later, and Carlo moved first, exactly the way he'd promised. Understand, I was not invited to that table. I was produced. Ren, the narrow man, collected me from the shop at noon with two others, courteous as a hearse, and walked me into a room of old men and older money where photocopies of my letters sat at every place setting like a menu. Carlo made the case with terrible warmth. The air had gone soft inside. The proof poured tea and grew flowers, gentlemen, and had promised, see page 3, to wait for him. A boss with a lifeline, he said, is a boss with a throat. He put his hand on my shoulder when he said it. Matteo did not raise his voice. He didn't look at Carlo at all. He looked at me, one long look, an apology, and a promise with no words in it, and then he opened a plain gray folder and dealt 2 years of arithmetic onto the table, page after page, the paper nobody thought a prisoner could keep. Transfers Carlo had signed with a dead man's authority. The skim off the harbor contracts, itemized in a prisoner's patient hand. The route order that put a 17-year-old behind that wheel, initialed, dated, kept. And on top of it all, a notarized statement from a young man 2,000 miles away, in Ivy, alive, whose handwriting leaned exactly like his brother's. The room read in silence. Paper, patience, restraint, the exact discipline that Street of Engines had knelt to, and every man at that table knew its signature. Carlo played his last card the way small men do, softly, at my head. And the girl? He said. A Severino weakness with a shop address. The room turned to me, 12 old faces, and the question was real, what does the family do with a throat? So I spoke. Nobody planned it, you could tell, because Matteo's jaw did something human when I stood. I took out the card that had lived in my registered drawer for months, stop writing, he is not what you think, last warning, and set it beside my place setting, next to the name card written for me in that same cramped, left-leaning hand. Same loops. Same choked little G. I said, your Regent's man has been opening a boss's private mail and threatening a florist, and he wasn't even careful about it. If I'm the weakness, gentlemen, I'm the weakness that reads. My voice shook exactly once, on florist, and held the rest of the way, and one of the old men laughed, a short, real laugh, and after that it was over in ways I only understood later. There was no thunder. At the top of that world, there is no thunder at all. The council voted with their faces. Carlo was stripped of every signature, every proxy, every key, exiled to a house upstate with his name intact and nothing else, escorted out breathing by men who no longer met his eyes. Ren was dismissed to the door with a single look from Matteo, and whatever waited on the far side of that look, it did not happen in that room, and it did not happen to me, and I have chosen to let that be the whole of my knowledge. My letters were gathered from 12 place settings by a man in white gloves and burned in the fireplace while the council watched, as witnesses, because Matteo asked it as his first act, the first order of the returned boss, nobody keeps her words but her. And then he did the thing I will be explaining to myself for the rest of my life. In front of all of them, the money, the age, the harbor, he took the prestolissum from his breast pocket, 2 years old, flat as faith, and laid it in the middle of that long table. This ran the family for 2 years, he said. Address your letters accordingly. Then he crossed the room and, in the doorway, where I stood shaking with my spine straight, the man the whole city knelt to went down on one knee. Not a proposal. Lower than a proposal. I knew the man, he said. You knew the man. The name was the only thing I ever kept from you, and it was the only thing that was never mine to give away. The shop survived the story. That still astonishes me more than the story does. The cooler hums in B flat, the apron hangs on its hook, Piero pretends to read racing forms by the lamppost and buys carnations for his wife every Friday, full price, and won't take the change. The street knows my name now. It is gentler about it than you'd think. He brought my letters back himself, the originals, his copies, the whole worn bundle bound in twine, edges gone soft as cloth from reading. They were never mine to keep, he said, and set them on the counter. I looked at them a long time. Then I pushed them back across the wood into his hands, where they had lived, where they had done their work. Then hold them where you held them, I said. He quoted my first one back to me, there in the cold among the buckets, it grows in pavement cracks, and told me the truth I'd crossed a whole dark world to hear, that the city fears the man he would have become without those envelopes. That I never saved him with $18,000 or with evidence, just with a B-flat cooler, and peonies, and mail days. He stays for closing now, most nights. And when the last customer lingered too long over the tulips one evening and asked, carefully, if I was the florist, that florist, Matteo didn't reach for anything, didn't stand, didn't perform. He just put his hand over mine on the counter, in the window, in front of the whole watching street, and let it be seen. That's the entire gesture. In his world it's louder than a wedding. The letters sit by the register where the alyssum used to be. The alyssum sits on top of them, white, flat, 2 years brave, the little flower that grows in pavement cracks, keeping watch over every word that made it home. Some people fall in love with a face and spend years learning the person. I fell in love with the person, and the face was the last thing I learned. I'm still deciding if that made it more true, or just braver. If the one who knew you best had hidden the one thing everyone else feared, would you have forgiven the lie? Tell me below, and if stories like this make your heart race, Raven Vow writes to you every week.